I'm very happy to be here today, happy to talk to you, and happy with the gracious welcome that I've gotten from all the Selenium folks, the contributors, and the community. It's been very exciting for me. I was around, as Jason said, during the launch of the project. I've been disconnected from it in many ways over the years, and it's very interesting to see what's happened and where things are today. I have a talk today that I've titled Science and Stories and Test Automation. And I want to talk about what is it to be scientific in science and how do we think about testing scientifically and why this is hard sometimes. And also talk about stories. I think that we've talked about stories as a way of organizing our work. We talk about story tests. But what I've found is that stories are actually the smallest unit of human understanding. And people who are professional memorizers and who are like the best memorizers in the world, they take raw data, they turn it into stories, and then they remember the stories. And that's because that's how we remember things, that's how we communicate. It's through stories. We don't store bits and bytes in our brains. It's not how our brains work. It's not how the hardware works. And so I want to talk about the stories that we tell about test automation and that we get from that. I want to start by telling a story about science, about the Wright brothers. I think most of you have heard most of this story. The Wright brothers were a pair of bike entrepreneurs in Ohio. This is in the late 19th century. At that time, the railroads had built out pretty much a national infrastructure, and you had the beginning of a national economy. The railroads were essentially the internet of the day, and you could build killer apps. And so you had, and Ohio was really the center of, it was Silicon Valley at the time. It was the center of innovation. You had Procter & Gamble figuring out how they could sell soap centrally and pushing it over the rail network, and became a big, big corporation out of that. And that's where the Wright brothers were. They were in Ohio at the same time, and they had a new startup idea, and it was called an airplane. And they wanted to figure out how to build one. Now, a lot of people were trying to build airplanes at that time, but most of them were making the mistake of using the waterfall methodology. And what they would do is they would have an idea for how they would build a plane, and they would analyze, design, build, and test. And they would take, the test was them constructing a plane, putting it on the top of a cliff, and then they would push it off. And some would go straight down, and some would kind of glide down, but none of them would take off. And that's because it just turns out you can't figure out how to build a plane using waterfall. You have to use a more scientific methodology. And what they did is they first had to figure out how to test, and they had to figure out how to test the components of the system. So they built a test harness. We call it a wind tunnel, and that they were the inventors of the wind tunnel. They invented that before they invented the airplane, and they would put airfoils in there, and they figured out what was the best design of an airfoil using their wind tunnel. They put the propellers in there. They built kites with the control surfaces on them so they could test the control surfaces before they attached them to the rest of the plane. So they tested all the pieces together. They also did some analysis of what were the ideal conditions for them to fly a plane, and they needed a certain kind of constant, steady winds. They got US governmental records that from the Weather Service, they found out the ideal place to launch a plane was in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So they packed up, they went to North Carolina, and that's where they first launched an airplane. It was because they were using the science. So I got a nice introduction. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I co-wrote a book called Lessons Learned in Software Testing. Some of you have read it. It still sells pretty well. I've also been the champion of Water Project since it was founded. I'm currently a staff QA engineer at Convio, and this is the best job I've had in 20 years. And I've had the best manager I've ever had in my life. Tom Lacey, can you stand up? We are hiring now. If you are interested, please talk to Tom. All right, end of commercial. Hope Jason's not too upset with that. So 20 years ago, I also worked at a great company, and I worked at a team. It was at Interleaf in Boston, and started as a Cambridge startup, MIT spinoff. And we had all these great practices on the team. We had nightly builds, we had weekly regression tests, we had built a homegrown source control system that supported no file ownership, no file locking, and group code ownership, and atomic commits. We also were really trying to figure out how to do test automation there because we were doing manual regression tests every week, which was very expensive and time consuming. And through several iterations, we went through different types of technologies, iterated through, we eventually settled into a scripting harness for testing that was very similar to Water and to what I'm doing today. So essentially, 20 years ago, I was doing agile development with something that looked a lot like Water. And much of my career has been trying to replicate that, that experience for me. What happened in the early 90s was that our company had a lot of defense contractors, very dominated by that, and the Cold War ended. And with that came massive cuts to the US defense budget, and I got laid off. So I decided at that time that I had learned enough about test automation and whatever that I decided to focus my career on it. I took a job at Segway, which was at that point another startup, and they were making a tool then called QA Partner. Later, that tool was essentially rebranded Silk Test. And I started trying to read about the testing literature because I wanted to take a more scientific approach. I had seen this great way of doing software development and of doing testing, and I wanted to understand more how to talk to people about it and how to share it with others. And what I found when I started reading the literature was that the books on testing, first of all, no one was reading them, and second of all, they didn't have any relationship really to what I had seen work. So it was very confusing to me. I didn't really understand that. I was working at a testing tool company, and I figured, well, they would be on top of the theory of testing, but there really was not really much of a theory of testing that was worth following at the time. And so a lot of people were just kind of doing what had worked for them before, and there was no pulling the ideas together and finding out what worked and didn't work, and no scientific thinking about testing. I eventually found a book by Kem Kainer, which I was thrilled with, and started to get to know him. I started writing about what I was doing with automation. I was building testing frameworks. I was a Silk Test expert back then. I started working at Segway, then I worked at several other companies as the Silk Test guy, and I was building testing frameworks that were making teams successful. I was writing about it. I wanted to share it with more people, and it was interesting as I got these things out there because, you know, a lot of us were doing the same kind of thing. So about that time, in the mid-90s, I got invited to attend a workshop called the Los Altos Workshop on Software Testing. And what happened around that time was there was a lot of different ideas about how should we do test automation. It was still a relatively new industry. People had different experiences. And Kem Kainer and Brian Lawrence invited a bunch of testing people. People had published articles. I had had one article out by then. And we all got together. And it turned out we all were in agreement. You didn't use the recorders. The vendors were talking about recorders. But the real way to do it is you built a framework. You built layers of abstractions. We didn't call them page objects back then, but they were the same darn idea. And that's what we found to make how you made maintainable tests. So we all agreed about this. This was in the mid-90s. We started talking about this. I mean, who was automating at that time, and who had a similar experience? Who had so anyone else was automating at that time who didn't have a similar experience? Okay, I only have a few people. So what I just did here, actually, I want to point out, this is called science. I made a claim, and then I tested the claim. That's the scientific method. You stand up, you make a story, right? You tell a story that is appealing, right? That's called a hypothesis. And then you test your hypothesis, and you run the risk of having to realize that the story that you fell in love with is going to be shattered. And so I just ran that risk, but that's the risk of being scientific, that we have that. And that was what we were doing with this group. We were all challenging each other, sharing ideas. We'd say, well, this is what I tried, and this worked and didn't work. And we'd say, well, how do you know it was that was worked? How do you know it wasn't something else? There was a lot of this challenging. This group of people, we continued doing this for years, and that's what really led to the publication of the book that I co-authored. We took all of those ideas that we had gotten out of these series of workshops and meetings that we had had, and we wrote that up as a kind of a form of distilled experience. Around that time, I had gone through a couple of times where I had gone through the recorder debate. But it hadn't been a debate. When I had been at Interleaf, we had developed a recorder. We had hired an engineer. He spent a year building recording technology built into our platform so that we could automate our tests. We tried that. We threw the whole QA team at it. nobody could get reliable tests with it, and so we gave up on it. We tried it, we found it didn't work, and we let go of it. At Segway, we had the recorders again. No one there used Segways internal to the company. When I was working there, I was in the consulting branch, we all knew they didn't really work. The first version of QA Partner didn't have a recorder. Eventually kind of got added. The sales guys wanted it. We're like, whatever. I guess it's kind of handy to use occasionally, but we really don't use it. It doesn't make a big deal. But what was happening now was as we started meeting as an industry and having these industry conferences, it became harder and harder for people to think scientifically about recorders. And people weren't using them. People who were successful weren't using them. No one ever stood up and said, oh, I love this thing. My whole team's using it, and we're getting great productivity. But what was happening is it was a great way to sell product. And the people who were the best at it were the sales reps for Mercury. They were pushing that stuff like crazy, and all kinds of managers were getting that message. They were selling, okay, you can do it. Anybody can be a scripter. Anybody can build these tests. It doesn't matter. No scripting required. And people were in love with that idea. I was trying, at that time, simply to teach people how to do testing in a way that I knew worked. And I was trying to teach testing frameworks. I was trying to teach the ideas to people. I had been working internally at a couple different companies teaching this stuff. I started becoming a consultant. I started wanting to speak at more conferences to do this kind of thing. But this recording story kept getting in my way. I kept saying, well, and I'd have to explain to people, they'd come and they'd listen and they'd raise their hand and say, well, why do I have to do all that? Why can't I just use the recorder? And so I started becoming more and more pointed. I put a talk, I think, at one of the conferences back then, and I think the title was Capture Replays for Fools. And the organizers were pretty uncomfortable with that talk because the vendors who essentially financed the entire conference were all these test tool vendors. But I went to them, I said, I'm giving other talks, and they said, we want something more positive. And I said, well, I've given you positive talks. I've told people how to do this, but they can't hear what I'm saying because they're in love with this other idea. And unless I give them a blunt, no, you can't do that, they won't take it. So I was trying to figure out how to explain to people how to get away from the grip of the recorders. Unfortunately, the sales guys kept getting ahead of me because just when I really found a way to convince testers why recorders weren't going to work for them, why the attraction there was a false attraction, they had figured out how to pitch the whole thing to the QA managers. And then I was like, oh, I need to figure out how do I convince a QA manager about this? So I would up that, I'd try to understand more about how managers were thinking, and I would change the way that my rhetoric and how I was couching my arguments. And then they were now selling to the director of engineering, and they had figured out how to sell at that level. And this kept going. So then I figured out, okay, how do I explain this just from an engineering perspective? And now they were talking to the CIO, and they were selling at that level. And at a certain point, I just kind of gave up with that. I just wanted to have a scientific approach to testing. I wanted to have people come together, share what worked and didn't work, and have us improve our abilities. And I felt I was being blocked by these tool vendors. And as this started happening, I started seeing more and more concerns that I had had with the tools. And in fact, it wasn't even that the better tools were winning out. I had used Silktest for a while. For a long time, it was a nice tool. I really liked it. But Mercury was beating them out with a much inferior technology because they had better sales. There was a lot of things going on. It wasn't just the recorders. All of the vendors were using vendor scripts at that time. And I came out with that term to try to argue against why you shouldn't be using a proprietary language to write your scripts in. There was a problem that Paul Hammond has talked about how you could not check this stuff into source control. They had too many blobby files and too many weird directories and stuff, so you couldn't actually put source management under the stuff. One of the things that was really getting me was the licensing structure. It was a very expensive license. Now, I'm talking in the past tense because for me, this is past tense. This is the world I used to live in. I know there's people that's still living in that world today. None of this stuff has changed for those people. It's changed for me. It's changed for the people I talk to. It's changed for you. But it's still licensed this way today. They're user licenses. They're very expensive, 5 grand, 10 grand a license. And the way it's just set up is all the QA people get a license, and no one in dev or build gets a license. And so what was happening was I was building these great test suites, and the tool vendors were keeping me from being able to keeping my company from being able to fully realize the value of the work that I had done in their tool. That seemed ridiculous to me. And this was where they were kind of blocking themselves on this. Why can't we put this on a build machine so it's running every night? Why can't we give this to the developer so that they can run it before they check it in? These things are obvious to us now because this is what we are all doing. Back then, it was like I knew that we wanted to do this, but you couldn't because we didn't have tools that we could use that way. The other thing that was really getting in the way of talking about this stuff was that many of these tools have gag licenses on them. If you read the commercial terms of the licenses, they prevent you from publishing reviews of the tool. So if you're something that you think's crappy about the tool, you can't actually talk about it. And if you wonder why there isn't more people complaining about this, it's because when they write the complaint, they get a letter from the company's lawyers telling them that they are in violation of that agreement. So this is an anti-science practice. And I finally realized, like, this is going crazy. How can we actually go ahead with testing as a form of science in this kind of environment? In early, I think this must have been about 2001 or so, I went to a conference. It was called the Test Automation Conference. It wasn't even about testing. It was just test automation. All the tool vendors were there. I was kind of excited because one of the keynote speakers had just published a book where he actually had published the code for his framework. And there had been a lot of hand-waving up until then about how you do test automation, a lot of diagrams and pseudocode, but people weren't really sharing the code in any way, shape, or form that they were using. And so it was really a dark art at the time about what to do. And so I was there. This keynote guy had written this code. He'd written this book. I had looked at it. It wasn't a great book. It wasn't a great framework, but it was doing something that hadn't been done before, in my view. And yet his talk had no code in it. It was like a code-free zone. Every talk at this conference, there was no code being shown anywhere. It's a test automation conference, but everyone's afraid of the code. Then I was a speaker at this conference, and I looked at my own talk, and I realized I'm doing the same thing. So an hour before I gave that talk, I threw it away, and I pulled out this little thing I'd been playing with, and I don't even remember exactly what tool it was. It was a little open source tool for driving Windows UIs in Perl, and I wrote a Perl script in that hour that would open up Notepad and type into it and save it to a file or something like that. And then I got up in my talk and I showed people it. I said, here's some code. You need to see code. And one of the things that happened in that conversation, I remember Danny Fout was in the audience, and he looked at my code and he says, you've got a bunch of sleeps in there. And there was a bunch of sleeps in there because I had written that in the past hour and I hadn't had time to figure out how to write it right. And we had that conversation. It was the first time I had a real conversation about test automation at a test conference because we had real code. We could look at it. We say, yes, why do we put them in there? When do we take them out? I've heard that conversation several times here. That was the first time I had heard that conversation at a conference. And it was like, oh, science was finally happening. We're finally taking ideas and testing them and advancing the art of what we're doing. And that was when I started to realize that open source might be what I needed to do in order to have a scientific approach to testing and in order to be able to take it so that people weren't just reinventing the wheel over and over and over again and that we could go further each time. So I researched the open source testing tools. At that time, I published a big directory of them. I looked at all kinds of them. I did a full survey. I also researched how these communities were organized and how they had formed and how they were run. And I held a small workshop around that time, and I made a public commitment at that workshop that I wanted to put Mercury out of business. I was so upset about this, and that was the vow that I made. And frankly, I feel like I'm done with that because for me and for my life and for my world, I don't see them anymore. I don't have to deal with them. I don't have to go to conferences that they dominate and that they suppress speech at. And so, yes, there's still people out there. It's still being used. There were some great numbers about where are we, is Selenium ahead of them or not or whatever. But I feel like I'm done with that. I feel like they are behind us. And I want to say that this is actually a tremendous achievement that has been made by people like you working together to say, how can we build something better? It's tremendous. After that, so anyway, at that time, I actually started the Water Project. I joined ThoughtWorks. Turned out half the open source tools that were being used were coming out of ThoughtWorks at the time. I met Jason, he told you that story about how we launched the Selenium and how that project got going. And then shortly after, in 2003, both the Water project and the Selenium project put out their first releases. And I showed them to a bunch of my friends, and we went through them. At that point, I was doing science. I was actually really sold on the Selenium idea at that moment, but at that point, Selenium was not gelled, and Water was working, and they said that's what they wanted, and that's what they used, and so I switched over, and I focused on developing that technology at that time. A few words about what I think the tools are. I think Water, its mission was very much about making testers better developers, and for us, open source was really a tactic. It was a way for us to build the tool. I think for Selenium, part of the mission of that was to make developers better testers and to get developers more involved in testing. If they weren't doing the testing themselves, they were at least providing the testing frameworks and making sure that they had them for their teams and that they were being used. And because of that, a lot of the superficial differences, I think, came out of that. Because the testing community was very pragmatic and almost all the users were on IE, we were happy to focus on IE. Because Selenium was really part of a deeper project of developers to kind of reshape the ecosystem, and many of them, it was not only to avoid Mercury, but it was to avoid having any vendor try to capture the platform. They wanted to have an open browser platform, and that meant supporting multiple tools and supporting open source tools. And so that was a key, deep mission of the Selenium project at that time. Some of the difference in Water, we focused on one language and one browser. Selenium became multi-language, cross-browser, a much more complicated project, but also, I think, a much more exciting project for a lot of people. I think you've heard in other talks about how the Water project is now going to be using WebDriver. We're going to get that cross-browser support. Even better, we've tried various ways of getting that over the years, and I think this is going to be the best way for us to get that. I think you've already heard about that. We're excited about that. So anyway, that's enough about Water. I want to talk a little bit now about Selenium, and what is the story about Selenium. Now, if I go to Selenium HQ right now, it's very clear what the story is about Selenium. You download the IDE, and then you write in the Celanese tool. That's the story of Selenium that is being told right now, that we are telling about Selenium. And what's already clear to me from the talks and from what I've heard is no one in this room believes that story. No one thinks that works. No one thinks that's a good idea, and no one really believes it. So it's confusing to me, and I'm feeling confused the way that I was back in the 90s with the commercial tool vendors. People are going there, and we're saying, and Patrick talked about it. Well, they start there, and then how do we migrate them off? You know, how do they keep using those tools? I worked with a company a couple years ago. They went in there, and then they said, well, this isn't working. We need to scale this up. So they used the user extensions. They pulled an unauthorized plugin that allowed them to do basically subroutining. And it was crazy. We were writing in like AppleSoft Basic or something was what it ended up being. We had global variables for everything, and it was just a crazy mess of a code base. Eventually, I convinced them to jettison that, and since they were starting over, why don't you just use Water? That's what I think is coming out of Selenium right now. I hear people, and they say, well, I tried Selenium, but Selenium doesn't work. Now, Patrick pointed out, when the IDE went out there, the hits went way up. A lot more people got interested in Selenium when the IDE was out there. But that's not surprising to me, because I saw the same thing in the commercial world. Once they started pushing recorders, yeah, they took off. The sales took off. So that's not really a new result or a different result. The question was, how many of those people were successful? I don't know the numbers on that, but I do hear people saying, I tried Selenium, and Selenium doesn't work. Now, in the Water community, we've kind of systematically pissed on people who build Water recorders. Some people have done it. We can't stop them from doing it. They come out there, we say, if you want to do it, you have to support it. We're not going to make it part of the suite. You have to take care of the people. Because the problem is it's much, much harder to build a good recorder than it is to build a good execution engine. And so what happens is people say, oh, I tried it. And what we wanted to say is, when we had people saying that, I tried the recorder, but Water didn't work. And what they meant is the recorder gave them something, And then they tried running it in water, and water didn't do what they wanted it to. But of course, the bugs were in the recorder, not in water. And that was kind of the problem that we had. It's very, very hard to build a good recorder. And it's very, very hard to get a lot of people helping make the recorder better because all the people who know better aren't using it. So no one's really incentivized to make a really good recorder. It's very hard to do, and everyone knows it's not going to work. So there's two pieces here. There's Selenium IDE, there's the recording aspect, and then there's Celanese. Now, for a while, the Celanese thing, this HTML tables that you use to write your scripts, I called that Squarehead Selenium because I was like, this is a mistake. Jason's already talked about it. He buys my argument now. He didn't buy it several years ago. But there's still people who are using it, right? So here's what I think we should do next. Let's not call it Celanese. Let's not call it HTML tables. Let's call that Selenium 0. That was the first version of the Selenium API. It was the API that JSFT had before we called it Selenium. It literally is Selenium 0. It is the very first API, and it's time to deprecate it. It's time to tell people they should not be using it. It's time to stop lying on the main page of the project, leading people towards something which everyone here knows is obsolete. I am really excited to be here. I'm excited to have the open arms that people have given me. People want to have me be more involved in Selenium. But the question I have right now is whether this is a scientific community and whether this is a community that puts science first or whether it's something that looks more at promotion and analytics and downloads and whether that's going to trump the idea of science and of doing what we know is right. That's the question I have for you. Thank you for your time.